In the aftermath of the Boston bombings and the massive manhunt which led to the death of one suspect and the arrest of another, both of them Muslims, there have been calls for increased surveillance and scrutiny of the public at large and Muslims in particular. On Fox News the other day, New York Congressman Peter King said, "If you know a threat is coming from a certain community, that's where you have to look." Proceed with caution here, Mr. King, and first take a look at that Council on Foreign Relations analysis of an FBI study showing that from 1980 to 2001, around two-thirds of domestic terrorism was carried out by American extremists who were not Muslims. That number actually skyrocketed to 95% in the years immediately after 9/11. And the magazine Mother Jones found that of the 62 mass shootings in America since 1982, mass killings defined as 4 deaths or more, 44 of the killers were white males. My guest, the journalist and columnist Glenn Greenwald, was flying here from his home in Brazil as events in Boston were unfolding. The investigation, once again, raised issues of civil liberties in the fight against terrorists. So we reached out to Glenn Greenwald, who as a former constitutional and civil rights litigator keeps his critical and contrarian eye on potential conflicts between national security and individual liberty. Among his best-selling books, How Would a Patriot Act? And most recently, With Liberty and Justice for Some, How the Law is Used to Destroy Equality and Protect the Powerful. Currently, Glenn Greenwald writes regularly for The Guardian. You can read him on their website. Welcome, Glenn. It's good to see you again.
Great to be back.
Was it right, in your opinion, for the suspect in Boston to be charged as a criminal rather than an enemy combatant?
Absolutely. There were very few people who even took seriously the idea that he ought to be charged as an enemy combatant for many reasons, including the fact that he's an American citizen on U.S. soil. And if there's one thing we're taught to think about our country, it's that the government can't punish people or put them in cages or threaten them with death without charging them with a crime, giving them a trial with a jury of their peers, and then convicting them beyond a reasonable doubt. But the broader question is, should we change or radically alter or dismantle our standard protocols of justice in the name of terrorism? That's been the debate we've been having since the September 11th attack, and I'm firmly in the camp that we need not and should not do that, and therefore he should be treated like any other criminal.
If it turns out that he and his brother had some significant contact with a radical organization back in their home country, would that change anything in your mind?
Well, I think that the most important thing that we need to start asking, and if that were the case, this question would become even more urgent, is why is it that there seem to be so many people from so many different parts of the world willing to risk their lives or their liberty in order to bring violence to the United States, including to random Americans whom they don't know? There has to be something very compelling that drives somebody to do that. And this was the question that was asked in the wake of the 9/11 attack, in the form of the sort of iconic question, why do they hate us? And the government needed to answer that question because people were quite rightly asking, and the answer that was fed to them was, well, they hate us for our freedom. And I think 10 years, 11 years later, people are very cynical about that answer and realize that that's not really the reason. Because what you see is that people from parts of the world that weren't part of 9/11 are now starting to attack the United States as well. And when they're heard, which is rare, but sometimes they are, about what their motive was, invariably they cite the fact that they had become so enraged by what Americans are doing to Muslims around the world, to their countries, in terms of bombing them, imprisoning them without charges, drone attacking them, interfering in their governments, propping up their dictators, that they feel that they have not only the right but the duty to attack America back. And so I think that the discourse then ought to really be focused on what is driving this war and how is it that we can do something that will, instead of perpetuating it further and exacerbate it further, start to think about how to undermine and dilute the sentiments that continue to fuel it, 12 years after the 9/11 attacks.
You wrote the other day of America's invisible victims, and they are?
The invisible victims are the women and children and innocent men who the United States continues to kill in places like tribal regions in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, at times in the Philippines, places throughout the Muslim world where the United States sends flying robots. We never hear about who those people are. And you can contrast it with the few instances in which the United States is attacked. We learn the names of the victims. We know their lives. We hear from how their family members are grieving. We never hear any of that in terms of the children, the women, and innocent men whom we kill in the Muslim world, and it's sort of an out of sight, out of mind dynamic where by not hearing about them, we never think about them, and by not thinking about them, we forget that they exist. And that's why when somebody attacks the United States, it leads to this bewilderment, like, well, what have we ever done to anybody that would make them want to attack us?
I think you were traveling when the Boston siege was unfolding, is that right?
Right.
When did you actually find out that it was happening?
What happened was I was flying overnight to the United States on Thursday night, which is when the shootout took place between the two brothers and the police, in which the older one was killed. And then Friday morning, when I got off the plane at JFK, was really the start of when people woke up and heard that there was this intense manhunt for the younger brother. And because I was traveling, I was generally in public places for the next several days, in airports, hotels, restaurants. And what I saw was everybody glued to the television in order to observe and engage with a very political event, which was this manhunt. And the reason that struck me was because there are very few events that really engage most people in the United States on a political level. Maybe there's one or two events like that every few years, maybe a national presidential election, but this was one of them.
Why do you call it a political event?
Well, it was political because it was infused with all kinds of political messages about Muslims, about radicalism, about what the proper role of the police and the military are in the United States. There were instantly these calls for greater surveillance. There was a lockdown of Boston, and a very extraordinary act that a major American city would be completely locked down. What you could see in how people were observing what it was that they were watching was their political impressions about the world, about their government, about political debates being formed based on the very few incidents that they really pay attention to. And I think that's the reason why incidents like this are incredibly significant in an enduring way, because it shapes how people who don't pay much attention to politics regularly really think about the world.
And you think viewers were evaluating this manhunt that was playing out in front of them through political lens?
Absolutely. I mean, it's inherently the case, because when somebody does something like detonates two bombs, one of which is placed behind an 8-year-old child, which it kills, and then tears off the limbs of dozens of other people, none of whom are known to the perpetrators, the question naturally arises, why would any human being engage in that behavior? And generally, when the person is a white Christian or white American, there's an attempt instantly to assure everybody that it's simply kind of a one-off, that it doesn't have a political content, that the person is mentally ill, that they're a lone actor, that they just snapped is usually the jargon, to assure everybody that there's no political conclusions that ought to be drawn. When the person, though, is Muslim, everything reverses. So there's no consideration to the possibility that they were mentally ill, that they simply snapped, that they were being driven by apolitical considerations of alienation or frustration about things in their lives. Instead, there's an assumption that this bolsters the idea that we face this grave and potentially even existential threat from radical Muslims against whom we've been fighting this decade-long war, and it really bolsters the premises of that war by ratcheting up the fear levels and by reaffirming the political convictions in which it's grounded.
But you agree that terrorism is a threat and has to be dealt with, not only in trying to understand what provokes it, but in trying to prevent it.
Sure. It's the responsibility of the U.S. government to prevent its citizens from being killed and attacked in the way that they were attacked in Boston. Unfortunately, the answers that are typically offered to that question of how can the government protect us usually end up not only not protecting us, but making the threat worse. So that's the problem, as I see it, is that the more we react by saying, well, we now need to go bomb further with drones, we need to infiltrate and surveil more, we need to put Muslims under more of a microscope and be more aggressive in how we attack them when we think they're a threat. I think the worse this problem becomes. I think that's the problem, is that the policies justified in the name of stopping terrorism have actually done more to exacerbate that threat and to render us unsafe than any other single cause.
That raises the really deep question, the serious question of how do we thrive as an open society and become the country that we want it to become when we are faced with the knowledge that these attacks can come when and where we don't expect them.
Well, this is the problem, is that the reality is that if you have an open society, then you can't prevent attacks like this. You can build enormous structures of security to prevent people from going on airplanes with bombs or guns, but then what do you do about trains or crowded malls or Times Square? And I think then that really underscores the choice that we have, which is, number one, we can do what we've been doing, which is become a more closed society, authorize the government to read our emails, listen in our telephone calls, put people in prison without charges, enact laws that make it easier for the government to do those sorts of things. Or we can try and understand why it is that people want to come here and do that. Why are people wanting to attack the United States this way, but not dozens and dozens and dozens of countries around the world? And I think we need to get to the bottom of that question in order to figure out how to stop these attacks, is to undermine the motive.